Hello, compliments of the season. Welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. From the war in Ukraine to the death of Queen Elizabeth II. On the program this week, we take a look at some of the biggest stories of the year 2022. In February 2022, the world watched in horror as Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the conflict between both countries. The invasion has resulted in tens of thousands of deaths on both sides and has caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. The invasion began on the morning of February the 22nd, 2022. When Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation aiming for what he termed the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Minutes later, Russian strikes and a large ground invasion were launched from three fronts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky enacted martial law and a general mobilization. Russia met a tougher resistance than expected, and after a failed attempt to take the capital Kyiv, the Russian forces were forced to retreat to the south and east. In August, Ukrainian forces launched a military counter-offensive to recapture regions occupied by Russia. In November, Russian troops were ordered to withdraw from Kherson, the only regional capital captured since the start of the invasion. According to the United Nations, an estimated 8 million Ukrainians were displaced within their country by late May, and 7.8 million fled the country by November 2022. Russia, within 5 weeks of the invasion, experienced its greatest emigration since the 1917 October Revolution. Officials in August estimated that Russia's invasion of Ukraine had caused $108.3 billion in damage to the country's infrastructure. The invasion has received widespread international condemnation. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, as well as on its ally Belarus. Over 1,000 companies also pulled out of both countries in response to the invasion. The sanctions have affected the economies of Russia and the world and has led to an energy crisis in Europe. The International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into crimes against humanity in Ukraine since 2013, including war crimes in the 2022 invasion. As of August, 40 countries had provided humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine, totaling over $80 billion. And in Ethiopia, after 2 years of civil war between the Ethiopian government and Tigray rebels, the two parties agreed to a truce in November. The war has killed thousands, displaced millions, and left hundreds of thousands facing famine. In a dramatic diplomatic breakthrough on November the 2nd, the Ethiopian government and Tigrayan forces agreed to a surprise deal, putting a halt to a 2-year war that has killed thousands. Both sides agreed to a permanent cessation of hostilities in an unexpected diplomatic breakthrough in South Africa, just over a week after formal peace talks began. Nigeria's former president, Olusegun Obasanjo, from the African Union mediation team, praised the process as an African solution to an African problem.
The two parties in the Ethiopian conflict have formally agreed to the cessation of hostilities, as well as to systematic, orderly, smooth, and coordinated disarmament, restoration of law and order, restoration of services, unhindered access to humanitarian supplies, protection of civilians, especially women, children, and other vulnerable groups, among other areas of agreement.
The Tigray War stems from a breakdown in relations between regional power blocs over control of Ethiopia. Since the agreement, the commander-in-chief of the Tigray rebel force has announced that 65% of his forces had withdrawn from the front lines. The Ethiopian authorities have also reconnected the capital of Ethiopia's Tigray region, Mekelle, to the national power grid after more than a year of cuts caused by war. While the toll of the war is still unknown, the UN and other relief agencies say that more than 2.6 million Ethiopians have been displaced. In August, the UN warned that half of those in Tigray face severe food shortages. To the COVID-19 pandemic, thankfully, much of the world returned to a degree of normalcy in 2022. But a notable exception was China, where major cities were kept in strict lockdown for several weeks under the country's zero-COVID policy, leading to mass protests.
For much of the world, 2022 marked the beginning of the end of the COVID pandemic.
We are much closer to being able to say that the emergency phase of the pandemic is over. But we're not there yet. Gaps in surveillance, testing, sequencing, and vaccination are continuing to create the perfect conditions for a new variant of concern to emerge that could cause significant mortality.
The shift was palpable after several failed reopening attempts in many countries. US President Joe Biden said in September the pandemic is over, referring to the changing behavior of Americans. New variants have remained closely related to the late 2021 Omicron variant without radically altering its impact. Vaccination and boosters are largely protective against severe disease and death, but global health officials caution the public against letting its guard down. The virus has killed almost 7 million people globally, with an ongoing daily death rate of close to 2,000 people. Access to vaccines, boosters and treatments remain unequal. In China, the zero-COVID policy is thought to have kept deaths to a minimum and has largely spared its healthcare system. But the large-scale lockdowns proved increasingly intolerable to the Chinese public, leading to rare, widespread protests. COVID's full impact on the global health is expected to come into sharp focus in 2023, with data showing ongoing disruption to all kinds of healthcare, from childhood immunisations to cancer screenings. Life expectancy and birth rates in many countries have fallen. Mental health concerns are also skyrocketing. The WHO and its members are hashing out a pandemic treaty to govern a better response to future outbreaks, and they remain on alert for a new variant that could dramatically undermine current vaccines and treatments.
And in July 2022, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated, stunning the world and a nation where gun violence and political attacks are rare. The 67-year-old was Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister.
The ceremony started with Abe's ashes carried into the Nippon Budokan Hall in central Tokyo by his widow, Akie, to music from a military band and the booms of the honor guard salute which echoed inside the hall. A moment of silence was followed by a retrospective of Abe's political life and speeches by leading ruling party figures, including Fumio Kishida and Yoshihide Suga, Abe's successors as prime ministers. Speaking from his point of view as Abe's friend, Suga noted that many people in their 20s and 30s had shown up to offer flowers.
Her Royal Highness, the Princess Brunei Salam.
Foreign dignitary guests included US Vice President Kamala Harris, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and President of the International Olympic Committee Thomas Bach. Abe was widely admired abroad, but he was a divisive figure at home. As the ceremony began, thousands of protesters marched on the streets of Tokyo, carrying placards and shouting slogans against the state funeral of the former Japanese Prime Minister. Many of those who oppose the funeral and Abe's political legacy are older Japanese. In a country traumatized by war, the older generation has long favored a pacifist constitution that has kept Japan from heavily investing in its military. Abe, however, sought to change that, not by a referendum or parliamentary process, but by reinterpreting the constitution. The 67-year-old politician was assassinated in July, shot twice by a homemade gun. The killing shocked the country unused to gun crimes or political violence.
Well, first it was Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss, and then just weeks later came Rishi Sunak. The United Kingdom undoubtedly went through a turbulent time in its politics in 2022, with 3 prime ministers in the span of just months.
Boris Johnson bowed out as British Prime Minister in September, ending a tumultuous 3 years in office.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
The move came following a wave of resignations from Boris Johnson's government and Conservative Party over a series of scandals. Mr Johnson also became the first serving UK Prime Minister to be sanctioned by the police for breaking the law after breaching COVID rules.
I've received a fixed penalty notice from the Metropolitan Police relating to an event in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020. And let me say immediately that I've paid the fine and I once again offer a full apology.
Following a leadership contest over the summer within the Tory party, triggered by Johnson's resignation, Liz Truss was appointed Prime Minister.
I have a bold plan to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform. I will cut taxes to reward hard work and boost business-led growth and investment. I will drive reform in my mission to get the United Kingdom working, building and growing.
However, her unpopular economic plans spooked the markets and caused the value of the pound to tumble. She was eventually forced to resign after just 6 weeks, making her the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history.
I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Despite losing the leadership contest to replace Johnson, Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister in late October.
That I am not daunted. I know the high office I have accepted, and I hope to live up to its demands. But when the opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, only your willingness. So I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future, to put your needs above politics, to reach out and build a government that represents the very best traditions of my party. Together, we can achieve incredible things. We will create a future worthy of the sacrifices so many have made, and fill tomorrow and every day thereafter with hope.
The 42-year-old is the first Prime Minister of colour and the first of Indian descent. The former investment banker and hedge fund manager is now trying to get the British economy back on track while attempting to unite the Conservative Party, which saw 3 Prime Ministers in just 3 months.
When Foreign Dispatches returns in just a moment, we reflect on how the UK and the world mourned the passing of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us on Foreign Dispatches. Britain's Queen Elizabeth II died in September after 7 decades on the throne. Her passing was mourned around the world and the funeral watched by millions.
From Westminster Hall, the Queen's oak coffin, draped in flags and topped by the imperial state crown, was pulled along a gun carriage by 142 Royal Navy sailors with arms linked. And they were preceded by a procession of hundreds of military personnel in full ceremonial dress. King Charles and Princes William and Harry and other members of the royal family walked behind the coffin. After about 16 minutes, the Queen's coffin is carried into Westminster Abbey, the building where she got married and was crowned Queen. The Queen's oldest great-grandchildren, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, formed part of the royal family procession as her coffin was carried into the hall. Waiting at the service were hundreds of foreign dignitaries, world leaders and royals. The Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Baroness Scotland, read the first lesson.
Now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that sleep. Then cometh the end. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death.
Then the Archbishop of Canterbury paid tribute to the late Queen in his sermon.
Service in life, hope in death. All who follow the Queen's example and inspiration of trust and faith in God can with her say, "We will meet again."
After the sermon, a 2-minute silence was observed. Then, the national anthem was sung for the new king.
Let us commend to the mercy of God, our Maker and Redeemer, the soul of Elizabeth, our late Queen, in glory forever. Amen.
During the service, central London was at a standstill, areas usually teeming with people totally deserted. Many, emotional, gathered in open spaces to watch the funeral on big screens erected for the event.
Do you know what? I think everybody was just they were quite emotional because she's been, our queen for a lot of years. We're never going to see another a queen. So yeah, it's been fantastic.
I think it's totally beautiful. It represents a lovely day. We're celebrating the Queen's life. I felt I had to be here. I travelled to London the other day to visit her while she was in state, and I queued 12 hours.
Let us pray to the Father,
and it was worth every minute of it. She's given so much to our country and the world, and I just felt that I could give her 24 hours of my life. I am totally devastated she's not with us anymore.
After the service, the coffin begins its final journey through central London, past the Queen's Buckingham Palace, home to the Wellington Arch at the Hyde Park corner, with the monarch and the royal family following on foot during the 1.5-mile procession. From there, it was placed on a hearse to be driven to Windsor Castle, west of London, for a service at St George's Chapel. About 800 people were in attendance. At the service, the imperial state crown and the orb and scepter, symbols of the monarch's power and governance, were removed from Queen Elizabeth's coffin, signalling the end of her reign. Then her coffin was lowered into a vault at Windsor Castle, her final resting place.
Thus it hath pleased Almighty God to take out of this transitory life unto his divine mercy the late, most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, and sovereign of the most noble Order of the Garter.
Later, at a private ceremony, the 96-year-old was buried with her husband of 73 years, Prince Philip, who died last year at the chapel, where her parents and sister, Princess Margaret, were also laid to rest.
And finally, on the program, the world's most prestigious sporting event was held in the Middle East for the first time. Qatar played host in 2022, welcoming visitors from across the world.
Despite the controversies surrounding Qatar's hosting of the World Cup 2022, the tournament received massive global interest. Argentina left Qatar as world champions for a third time after a dramatic final match against France, beating them 4-2 on penalties. The 2022 FIFA World Cup was broadcast globally through 236 different broadcasting deals and broke TV audience records in numerous countries. According to FIFA, an average audience of 24.1 million watched the final match in France, nearly 5 million higher than the 2018 final between France and Croatia. Almost 20 million viewers tuned in to the grand final in the UK. Given the minimal infrastructure Qatar had in place at the time it was awarded the hosting rights to the World Cup, 7 new stadiums were erected ahead of the tournament, as well as new hotels and expansion to the country's airport, rail networks and highways. Dubbed the most expensive World Cup in history, the 2022 FIFA World Cup cost Qatar an estimated $220 billion.
And that brings to an end our wrap-up of major stories in the very eventful year 2022. Wishing you and your loved ones a pleasant 2023. Till next time, I'm Teniola Oyetayo. Bye for now.